Hello everyone, and welcome. We're here again with another not-so-wholesome story, retelling it from a perspective that may not be so common. Our tale today starts back in 1997 and takes place in the province of Alberta, Canada, specifically near the southern part of the Canadian Rockies, a system of mountain ranges that span between the interior plains of North America and the Pacific coast. The place we're focused on lies in the western area between Banff and Jasper and was usually traveled to by turning off the highway between Calgary and Edmonton. It's a location filled with snowy wooded hills and lush terrain. These types of areas are a great site for various tourist spots and vacation resorts, national parks, ski lodges, cozy cabins, etc. The mountains just made for your perfect classy woodland holiday getaway. A sentiment that was shared by one Robert Washington, a well-known local filmmaker from the US. Robert had recently seen much success in Hollywood, with his latest film at the time being the critically acclaimed Blood Monastery, and so in looking to utilize his wealth, he thought it beneficial to purchase a sizable amount of land and property on one of said mountains. Blackwood Mountain, consequentially and colloquially referred to as Mount Washington, had already been home to the area referred to as Blackwood Pines, which featured a hotel, sanatorium, park ranger stations, and old mining tunnels. But of particular interest to Washington was the use of his newly acquired estate to build a ski lodge, a large mansion-like building nestled in the woods of the mountain, a large distance away from the nearest major public road, and mostly accessible via ski lift. The lodge was constructed after demolishing the upper portions of the previously existing Blackwood Hotel, an establishment that Washington had also acquired in the purchase. The abandoned lower half of the hotel effectively served as a foundation to the newly built lodge, where Robert, his wife Melinda, and 3 kids, Elizabeth, Joshua, and Hannah, would frequently go to visit whenever they were on summer or winter vacation, away from their home in Burbank, California, or just had an otherwise special family occasion. The lodge was also sometimes used as a shooting site for some of Robert's filmmaking endeavors, although none that had officially hit the big screen up to that point. For many, this acquisition would seem like a dream come true, and for all intents and purposes, it was. The family made full use of the lodge, and the kids relished their vacations skiing or snowboarding down snowy hills in the day, and having an entire cozy wooden lodge to rest and snuggle up in at night. It was a welcome getaway from their usual, much more heated life, literally and figuratively, in California. Though it's not to say that it didn't come without a couple of rough patches for the Washington parents. For starters, the shutting down of the Blackwood Pines Hotel obviously didn't sit well with some of the employees who had worked there previously, despite whatever consolations and reparations Robert could come up with for them. In addition, the land around Blackwood had been particularly special to some of the local indigenous folk, who, although they hadn't occupied the land at the time, still impressed upon Washington the sacred nature of the land in which he had recently been building on. Naturally, the amenities of the ski lodge wouldn't simply stop at just making the house. It'd expand to the surrounding wilderness areas as well. Sheds, generators, guest houses, cable car stations, even a shooting range. So there was some bad blood that had brewed over the years. Protesters had rallied in front of the estate at one point to speak out against the occupation of the site, though they ultimately had no impact on Robert's goals. Property politics aside, the acquisition seemed to have been an overwhelmingly positive one for the movie mogul. That is until 17 years later, when an unfortunate tragedy would unexpectedly come to pass at their beloved holiday getaway. Nearing midday on February 2nd, 2014, Alberta police in Blackwood County received a call at the station. The man who made the call was evidently distressed and urgent sounding. He had called to make a missing persons report and to request the assistance of the local authorities in finding 2 of his children, whom he said had mysteriously gone missing the night before on Blackwood Mountain. And as I'm sure you all can guess, the caller was none other than the famed movie mogul, Robert Washington. The station dispatched officers to gather information from the Washington family and their guests up at their lodge, and began working on the case right away. Now in 2014, the Washington children were all college students, with the younger twins, Elizabeth and Hannah, having just begun their freshman years. At this stage in their lives, their need to hang out and party with friends was at its peak, and so the three Washington children had begun a tradition to invite friends from their schools up to their parents' mountain ski lodge to do just that. And indeed, it was the perfect getaway. Now free from the supervision of parents, where they could just do what they pleased and just have a wacky, fun, good time. They would send out invitations early in January, and throughout the course of the month, 7 of their friends would confirm their attendance for the date. Joshua, the eldest of the siblings at 19 years old, was understandably designated as the one in charge of making sure everything went fine with the lodge and keeping everyone in check, especially since these private getaways were largely spearheaded by him in the first place, with eager backing from his sisters. Hannah, the older of the twin Washington siblings, was more reserved than her brother and sister, but was still very excited to join her friends and siblings on the trip to the lodge. Her younger twin, Elizabeth, was also eager to hang out and just have fun, more excited to just be away from the stressful times of academics. She and Hannah had invited some of their old classmates from their senior year in high school, including Hannah's best friend, Samantha Giddings, and others in her and her siblings' friend group, including one Jessica Riley, Ashley Brown, Matthew Taylor, Emily Davis, and her boyfriend at the time, Michael Monroe. Meanwhile, Joshua would invite his best friend, Chris Hartley. According to Joshua, who had arrived at the lodge with his sisters in the afternoon of that Saturday, the three had been busy preparing the place for their stay. Their friends would arrive sporadically throughout that evening, and by the time 8 p.m. rolled around, everyone was accounted for and the party began. The teens spent most of the night drinking, talking, listening to music, and playing party games. They weren't going to do any outdoor activities until the morning after, since night had already fallen and it was beginning to snow a fair bit outside. Joshua said that he and his friend Chris had been drinking close to midnight and had apparently passed out at some point. As far as Joshua and Chris knew, everything had been going great up to that point, so when he was shaken awake hours later near sunrise by his other friends, he was shocked to find out what had happened. The other kids had told Joshua that Hannah and Elizabeth had run out into the woods during the growing snowstorm outside at around 2 a.m., and neither of them had come back since. Joshua had still been groggy, but immediately expressed concern and asked why his sisters would even do such a thing. After all, they would have known better. Emily and Michael, the couple, had expressed that the twins ran out after Hannah had been upset about a joke they had made. They didn't give too many details to Joshua at that point, but they claimed that Hannah ran out first and Elizabeth had followed shortly after to presumably bring her sister back, and neither of them had been seen since. When Joshua asked why his group of friends hadn't woken him sooner, they said he simply wasn't waking up when they had tried, unsurprising given the amount of alcohol he had consumed the night before. Even when he was finally awake, he seemed too hungover to take any decisive action. At first, Joshua had thought that maybe the twins simply sought shelter at one of the guest houses around the estate and were staying there until sunrise. But considering that they didn't have the keys to the other buildings and the power for the guest houses wasn't running yet, that prospect seemed less likely. With the sun rising and the snow subsided, the kids at the house had begun a concerted effort to look around the area surrounding the lodge and see if they could spot any trace of the twins, but to no avail. And after arriving and assessing what had happened the night before, Robert Washington was the one who had ultimately made the call to summon the local authorities to investigate. It was upon further questioning of the teens that they gave further details about the conflict that made the girls run out of the house in the first place. It turns out some of the kids were playing a prank where they gave Hannah the expectation that she was going to be able to hook up with Michael Monroe, Emily's boyfriend. In truth, they just fabricated this to see what she would do. The other kids were aware that Hannah had a bit of a crush on Michael and did the prank in bad faith rather than out of just idle curiosity. Upon realizing that she was being pranked, a distressed and embarrassed Hannah had bolted out the front door of the lodge and into the snowstorm, followed soon after by her sister, who had been informed of what had just happened. The police had received all this information from the Washington family and their young guests at the lodge on the afternoon of the 2nd, and the authorities began their own search for the girls right away. They canvassed the Washington estate, looked through all the buildings and points of shelter that the family owned, including the aforementioned guest house, some utility sheds, the cable car station, an old park ranger outpost, and a few tunnels nearby. They had figured that if the girls had been out in a worsening snowstorm, they'd look for shelter in at least one of these spots. But these searches came up empty. There was no sign of the girls anywhere, no leftover material or footprints along the trails, since any they may have left would have been obscured by the falling snow. Fearing the worst, the search teams also kept their eyes open for any remains that may allude to the girls having perished in the storm. But no remains were found other than the usual carcasses of a couple animals that had been preyed upon. The authorities had also tried scanning the grounds of the old sanatorium nearby in the mountain, when all other locations turned up nothing. But this was a long shot, as there was little chance that the girls would have been able to get that far in the previous night's weather. Ultimately, that search also turned up nothing. Park rangers from areas surrounding the mountain had also been called to aid in the search, and a bulletin went out to all nearby locations to be on the lookout for the missing girls. The search for the girls on the mountain lasted a whole week, with the Washington parents publicly asking for anyone who might have seen the girls to provide any information that they had. They even offered a monetary reward for information, but no information ever came. Despite no concrete evidence, the Washingtons and the authorities weren't ruling out the possibility of foul play. As told by Robert and Melinda, their estate was no stranger to trespassers in the past, and Melinda often was unnerved by the odd hiker or traveler casually passing through what was considered to be their mountain on occasion. Still, the existence of trespassers only provided the possibility of someone else being present on the mountain that night. Investigators wanted to know of any enemies the family may have had that could have been responsible for anything untoward happening to the Washington girls. And the only rough patch that the family ever had in the local area that they could think of was with a man by the name of Jack Fiddler. Fiddler was of native ancestry and had discouraged them from pursuing their construction project on Blackwood Mountain, due to the land being sacred to his forefathers of the Cree tribe. It wasn't a strong lead, however, and investigation into the man hadn't yielded anything thus far. But since first contacting Fiddler, authorities hadn't been able to get a hold of him again as the investigation continued. Eventually, the days of looking out for the girls turned into weeks, and as time went on, hope of finding them began to dwindle. The loss put a strain on the Washington family, as one could expect. They had no idea what the fate of the twins was. The parents had lost 2 wonderful daughters and Joshua, his sisters. Naturally, life had to go on. The family had responsibilities, including Joshua, who had school to go back to. The investigation wouldn't be closed, but the disappearance weighed heavily on the Washington family. In particular, Robert had trouble continuing the work he had been doing on his next movie project, and placed a lot of his energy into comforting his wife and keeping the case of his missing girls relevant in the public eye. A year passed, and soon the cold case of the missing Washington girls seemed to become a fading memory. But sadly, the twins' disappearance wasn't going to be the only tragedy that would strike the Washington family at their beloved lodge. Quite the contrary, something even worse was yet to happen to the affluent movie mogul's family, and amazingly, on the very anniversary of the twins' disappearance. Now, it's important to understand the confusion surrounding these events that happened a year later, in order to get a feel for what authorities had to deal with, and how even to this day, the truth of what happened is so evasive. So let's go through everything as it was being discovered. On Monday, February 2nd, 2015, around 2:30 in the morning, mountain rangers stationed at a tower in the Blackwood County area received a distress call from one of the radio towers on Mount Washington. A girl was on the line, seemingly panicked and somewhat incoherent. There was some interference and static on the line that night, so what the girl said was difficult to make out. But after trying to communicate for some time, the ranger receiving her transmission was able to make out what she was saying. She said, quote, "We're on Blackwood Mountain by the ski lodge. There's a killer and he's after us." This followed by what sounded like the girl crying. The ranger on duty told the girl to not leave her position, that they would send out helicopters to her location as soon as the storm that night had subsided. And yes, there was in fact another snowstorm that very night as well, which proved to be highly inconvenient if what the girl was saying was indeed true. Normal motor vehicles wouldn't have been able to make their way up the mountain, and proceeding on foot to the tower that the transmission was coming from would have involved a fair amount of time and risk in the pitch black night. Or at least that's what the Ranger Service later claimed in their explanation as to why it took so long for help to arrive on the mountain. It wasn't until around 6:30 that morning, nearly 4 hours later, that rescue helicopters were finally deployed to respond to the unknown girl's distress call. And upon reaching the tower where the call had come from, the pilot and rescue team within were shocked to find that the radio tower itself had totally collapsed. A support wire had apparently been broken, and the structure itself seemed to have leaned over and dropped off of the elevated hillside that it was on, and down to a lower flat section of ground, which gave way into one of the old tunnels that were common in the area. An insane discovery, the rescuers observed the destroyed surroundings carefully. They found no signs of anyone, certainly no sign of the person who had made the distress signal earlier that morning. If the girl had been inside the tower at the time of the collapse, it could have been possible that she might have fallen deeper into the tunnels below. But the rescue helicopter team didn't have much time to ponder this further, as not too long after they had arrived, a loud sound echoed through the cold winter air, and a large fiery explosion could be seen lighting up the dim dawn sky some distance away. It seemed to be just one crazy happening after another, as though the mountain that night had been a war zone. Another nearby helicopter proceeded to the site of the massive explosion, and it was discovered that it was in fact the Washington's very own ski lodge had been the location that the explosion erupted from. As the helicopter approached the lodge, it could be seen, fully engulfed in flames, its wooden windows and walls blown out and destroyed from the explosion's impact. The destruction of the Washington's property was a horrible sight in of itself, but the more concerning thought was obviously if there had been anyone actually staying in the building that night, and if so, would they have managed to make it out of the building before it had exploded? But the lack of any human life outside in the surrounding area of the lodge gave no hope as to whether that may have been the case. And so the rescue team descended, calling in further help from the nearest firefighting services to deal with putting out the blaze. Authorities now had 2 locations on Blackwood Mountain that had been brutally devastated: a collapsed fire tower and a lodge on fire. More and more personnel had to be deployed onto the mountain to deal with the situation, and naturally, it being their property, the Washingtons were contacted as part of investigating the disaster. It turns out Robert and Melinda were not at their vacation home that fateful Monday morning. They were staying at a relative's elsewhere in Alberta. But the call from the authorities was like a traumatic kind of deja vu for them. Not just because it was the anniversary of when their daughters had gone missing, but because just like the year prior, their son Joshua had once again taken his friend group back up to Blackwood Mountain the day before for their now annual Blackwood winter getaway. Joshua Washington, just a month prior, had expressed to his parents that he wanted to continue his and his sister's tradition of going up to Blackwood with friends. He said he saw it as an opportunity to keep the twins in everyone's thoughts and show that their disappearance hadn't broken up the entire friend group. He had sent out invitations to pretty much anyone who had been at the lodge the previous year: Samantha Giddings, Jessica Riley, Ashley Brown, Emily Davis, Michael Monroe, and Matthew Taylor, and of course his best friend Chris. They all would have ventured up to the mountain the previous evening to begin their stay. So with this knowledge, and the knowledge that the absolute hellscape condition that the mountain properties were found in that morning, no one had a good feeling about the events, especially not the Washingtons. Until the fire was under control, it could not be said for certain what had happened to the kids that were supposed to have been on the mountain that night. But before authorities could worry about that, 2 figures had been noticed from an above helicopter, walking along a path adjacent to the woods, slowly towards the site of the fire. They were the first signs of any human life on the mountain, and before the two people could reach their destination, a couple of the rescue team members had rushed to meet up with them and discern their condition. One of them was a young man dressed in a college letterman jacket, and next to him, using his shoulder for support, was a young girl who looked badly bruised and scratched, wearing an odd mix of jeans, a thin blouse that was too light for the weather, and a tattered and oversized old jacket. Both appeared worried and shaken, especially the girl, who was particularly weak and seemed to be on the verge of tears. When asked to identify themselves, the two confirmed that they were Matthew Taylor and Jessica Riley, two of the friends that had been invited by Joshua up to the mountain. And when asked where they had come from, they explained that they had both ended up around one of the old mines in the area, somewhere between where the radio tower had collapsed and the direction of the lodge. The two were given warmth and sustenance before ultimately being moved off the mountain around 8 o'clock to one of the police stations in Blackwood County to give their report on what happened, as everyone working on the mountain that morning were trying to find out. This was before Robert and Melinda Washington had even arrived, and before the extent of the damage caused by the explosion could be assessed. But it wasn't long after the two kids had been taken away that the fire services put out the blaze and scanned the burnt Washington property. Those on duty had hoped that since two of the kids had been found outside the lodge that morning, then perhaps that could mean that the rest of the 6 kids would have been away from the lodge as well. But sadly, it didn't take long for the rescue team and fire service personnel to come out with the news that inside the charred wooden Washington lodge, several dead bodies were found amidst the wreckage. The young group of friends had been inside the building when it went up in flames, and there were no survivors. Upon examining the destroyed interior of the lodge, fire service personnel found the bodies of 19-year-olds Samantha Giddings, Chris Hartley, Emily Davis, and Michael Monroe, as well as the 18-year-old Ashley Brown, all at different spots in the large main living area. Also in the living area, fire services regarded the broken gas pipe, which was connected to the large fireplace on one side of the room. It had been immediately speculated that a gas leak from the broken line had resulted in the devastating explosion that had cost these teens their lives. But it was still a mystery as to how or why the gas line had been damaged in the first place. Examining the pipes later, it seemed to have been the result of a blunt impact to the pipe, disconnecting it from the fireplace. At first glance, the awful scene seemed to be the result of just a freak accident, possibly the result of some negligence by a bunch of drunk, roughhousing college kids. So the rescue team were still on the hunt for more missing persons after the whole fire debacle. They hadn't searched the entire lodge yet, so that was their first area of concern, since that's where everyone else, except for the 2 teens, Jessica and Matthew, were found. The explosions had destroyed most of the ground floor and upper floor of the lodge, but the basement of the lodge seemed mostly unharmed. Meanwhile, the 2 teens that were found alive outside, Matthew and Jessica, were being questioned at one of the local stations to hopefully paint a clearer picture of what had taken place. The interviewer began by asking the 2 teens how they'd arrived and how the night generally started. The 2 gave separate accounts, but generally the information they gave is as follows. According to Jessica, she and Michael Monroe were among the first of the guests to arrive at the mountain, around 8:30 p.m. Joshua had already been around preparing some of the nearby guest houses around the estate, and met with them at the cable car station. They met Josh, at which point he led Michael up to the house with the couple's bags, while they suggested that Jessica stay behind to welcome the other guests as they arrived, and to open the door for them to exit the cable car landing. Once all the guests had arrived, Michael Monroe had gone back to the cable car to get Jessica, and they headed back up to the lodge. According to both Jessica and Matthew, once inside the lodge at around 10:45, the group of 8 soon split up to do their own things. For Matthew, he said that Emily had forgotten one of her bags further down the mountain, and she wanted his help to go back down and find it. So those 2 had ventured back outside around 11 p.m. Meanwhile, Jessica said that her and Michael went to check out one of the guest houses on the other side of the grounds so they could have their own alone time. Now, during her account, Jessica was still quite badly injured and weary. She had bruises and scratches, was in a fair bit of visible pain, and claimed that she was having trouble thinking and recalling events. So the interviewers decided to go over more immediate events to jog her memory, starting from where she and Matthew had come from to arrive at the lodge that morning, as the fire had just erupted. Both her and Matthew had mentioned when they were found that they had traveled from one of the old mining tunnels on the grounds. When asked how she ended up in the mines, Jessica said she had been carried there, but her memory was fuzzy, so she wasn't able to give clear details about how she had been carried. From what she could recall, she had been at the guest house that she and Michael had gone to check out when she was grabbed and taken all the way through the snow to the mine by something with overwhelming strength. When authorities would later investigate the grounds, they would indeed find that there had been some damage to one of the guest houses. Specifically, the windows in both the bathroom and the front door had been broken. When suggesting the possibility of a wild animal having taken her, Jessica just insisted that whatever it was, it most likely lived inside the mines. Jessica wasn't sure when, but it was evident that she had been passed out for quite some time in the mines, because up until she and Matthew had been found by the rescue team, she had only been awake for what had felt like 2 hours. It was during this line of questioning that Jessica recalled Michael having followed after her to try and help her. She wasn't aware where he had gone or at what point they had been separated from each other, but she was even further pained to know that Michael was a casualty of the Washington Lodge fire. Evidently, Michael had at some point returned to the lodge without Jessica, despite her claim that he had been around after she had been taken. Matthew claimed that on the way back to the cable car, both he and Emily had heard a desperately loud and agonizing screeching in the woods. At first, they dismissed it as some kind of animal in the forest, but then they were shocked further to have found what looked like a boar's head on a wooden stake in the forest. Matthew, at the time, felt confident that it was just a prank by either Joshua or Chris to mess with them, as it was very customary for the boys to do. But during the interview, Matthew wasn't so sure anymore. The discovery had unnerved both him and Emily at the time, enough that they just decided to make their way back to the lodge. On their way, Matthew said they ran into Christopher and Ashley. Ashley seemed to have had blood all over her, and both teens were frantic and desperate. They told Matthew and Emily that a man, a maniac, they had called him, had just killed Joshua right in front of them. They weren't being too clear on the details, but based on their friends' panicked and terrified expressions, Matthew and Emily figured that it wasn't just a prank being played. They decided that it was worth going to get help from off the mountain. Matthew and Emily first went back to the lodge, where they had left Chris and Ashley to recover from whatever events that they had just experienced, and then decided to go to the cable car around 1 a.m. to head down and get help from off the mountain, as there was no phone service at their location. Matthew said that when they got there, however, the cable car station had been ransacked and the cable car itself had been stuck out in the middle of the line, with no way to call it back toward their station without the key for the console that controlled it. So instead, the two had decided to head for the nearby radio tower to call for help, and this call would have been the very same one that the mountain rangers would have picked up that started this part of our story. Matthew said that immediately after the radio transmission, that's when disaster really struck for the two. According to him, the tower unexpectedly began to collapse, and the two teens held on for dear life inside the cabin at the top of the structure, as it toppled over and plummeted deep into the ground, creating a hole that led into one of the old abandoned mining shafts. While Matthew had been able to steady himself atop the now horizontal radio tower, Emily had been stuck on one of the lower metal bars of the structure. He tried to reach for Emily, but in doing so, his weight would have sent the tower falling even deeper. He said he would have had to get off the tower in order to help Emily more, but upon jumping away to a nearby stable patch of ground, the shaft ultimately gave away and the tower, along with Emily, descended further downward to where he could no longer see her. That would be the last time Matthew ever saw Emily that night. It was from there that Matthew tried to find his way out of the winding labyrinthian mining tunnels, when hours later he would stumble across the bruised and battered Jessica, struggling to walk and find her way out. The two would make their way out of the mines together, which is where they would soon be found by the rescue team, walking along a path back to the lodge. So by the time interviewers were done with their questioning, they had numerous elements to what had gone on that night, and still a lot of questions that needed answering. Both of the teens had experienced two different and seemingly unrelated events from what had happened in the lodge, which only barely shed light on one mystery, that mystery being what happened to the radio tower. But their stories raised further alarming questions. Was Joshua Washington really murdered, like Matthew had been told? What could have taken Jessica into the mines? And who was responsible for the structural damage at the guest house? The exact circumstances leading up to the explosion were still completely unknown. Needless to say, the Washington family was absolutely distraught over everything that had been discovered from that night. And yet there was undoubtedly more to discover. But for Robert and Melinda, the first priority was making sure they didn't lose their last remaining child to Blackwood Mountain. After all, the whereabouts of Joshua were still unknown. They would invest everything they had into unraveling the mystery of what had happened that night. The local police force, private investigators, mountain ranger services, nature experts, even psychics were brought in with the hope that their work would lead to the safe return of their son. After getting the story from Matthew, investigators were sent out to one of the maintenance sheds on the grounds of the Washington estate, which is where Matthew had said he had initially heard from Chris and Ashley that Joshua had been murdered. If what the two young adults told Matthew had been true, then the event would have occurred in or around the shed area, and it didn't take investigators long before they found something. It wasn't Joshua, nor was it a body. What they found inside of particular interest was the torso of a dummy wearing a plaid shirt, strung up onto a wall, and a horizontal buzzsaw on a stationary stand, which was also covered in dried blood. An ominous sight to be sure, but still investigators didn't find any bodily remains apart from the blood, which, despite the fake dummy, the blood appeared to be real. Finally, on further inspection of the outside of the shed, investigators found a patch of snow that had a faint dark stain on it. It also appeared to be the remnants of blood, possibly spilled there hours prior. The authorities had these items taken in and later examined them for whatever information they could provide. The dried blood on the dummy and the buzzsaw had been tested, and it was revealed that the blood didn't even belong to a human. It was in fact pig's blood. The dummy was also covered in pig blood. Investigators wondered if this particular find was merely a part of some fake scene put together by the Washingtons. After all, Matthew had mentioned having seen a boar's head somewhere on the grounds that night, which search teams did eventually end up finding in a discarded pile with some wires. When asking Robert Washington about this, he denied knowing anything about the saw or the dummy, but he did mention that it was common in his line of work to put together gory scenes by using fake blood from an animal in this way. Who had been responsible for putting together the fake scene, however, remained a mystery. But surprisingly, not all of the dried blood found at the shed was pig's blood. In fact, the blood found in the snow outside was actually tested to have been from a human, but there was no real hint of who it could belong to. All forensics could eventually surmise at first was that the blood didn't belong to any of the kids from the lodge. So again, the search for Joshua remained cold. But then that added another piece to the puzzle of this case. Someone else was on the Washington grounds that night, which at this point only gave some credence to Matthew's story of what Chris and Ashley had mentioned to him, of an unknown man being on the grounds that night. While nothing else was found at the maintenance shed, more investigators were searching all other prime points of interest on the estate. The first place of investigation for the case would of course be the Washington Lodge and its surroundings. Unfortunately, most useful evidence inside the lodge itself had been damaged or just completely lost in the fire. Examining the remains of the structure, there hadn't been anything investigators could use to point them in the direction of where Joshua might be, or if the fire was even an accident or not. But there was something notable about the victims inside the lodge when their bodies had been sent for examination. Specifically, Michael Monroe, who upon examination seemed to have had 2 fingers missing from his left hand, the ring and pinky finger. So this was very strange because as far as Michael's parents and his other friends from college knew, Michael wasn't missing any fingers up to the point he was last seen before coming to the lodge. Additionally, for Emily, her jacket was torn at the shoulder, and she had relatively long and shallow cuts at the top of it, as if scratched and clawed at. Investigators couldn't tell if any of this was related to the incidents that occurred, or if these wounds were just separated, isolated incidents. Further into the search, authorities found numerous curious items of interest throughout the basement complex, including cables hooked up to hidden cameras and movie props. They also found a passage under the house that connected to the previously discontinued Blackwood Pines Hotel that the lodge was built over. Wanting to cover all their bases, they investigated the entire area, which took a lot longer than anticipated, but bore more interesting evidence, including recently printed fake newspapers and various mechanisms in the lodge that controlled movie props scattered about. They found a makeshift freezer which looked like it doubled as a butcher shop, with multiple pigs strung up on hooks around the room. And finally, upon investigating footage caught on various cameras that were hidden around the basement, authorities were presented with a clearer picture of what had gone on that night. The footage showed different instances of the teens being inside the lodge, being filmed without being aware of it. It showed Matthew, Emily, Jessica, and Michael leaving the lodge earlier that night. Footage showed the movement of a panicked Chris and Ashley searching the basement and being repeatedly startled by the horror movie props that were set up down there. It showed images of Samantha being chased by someone in a mask, and it showed footage of both Joshua and Ashley being strung up by their hands in the maintenance shed outside the lodge. And the saw blade, the one discovered in the shed, was placed on a machine which slowly allowed it to cut open Joshua's body in half. It was like a scene from a Saw movie, possibly a snuff film. Only, as it was earlier discovered, it wasn't Joshua's body that was cut in half, but a dummy. No human DNA had been found on either the saw or the dummy. Also shown was when Ashley and Chris returned to the lodge after telling Emily that Joshua had been killed at the maintenance shed. Unfortunately, there was no indication of how the two of them, along with Joshua, even ended up at the shed in the first place. Meaning that despite all the genuine terror that Chris, Ashley, and Samantha had exhibited in the footage, all of these on-camera events had been fabricated, and Joshua himself was likely unharmed. Which now begs the question, could the movie mogul's son have been responsible for this? Was it all merely an elaborate sequence of pranks, meant to be caught on video, utilizing his knowledge of filmmaking? And if so, how far was it actually meant to go? Were the deaths of the 5 teenagers a horrific accident, or was it an event of intention? Was his assumed murder that was recorded in video just him faking his own death? All these questions and more ran wild. And when confronted with video evidence, Joshua's parents were both shocked and visibly worried that maybe there might be some validity to some of the theories now being put forth about their son. And there was a reason for this, because despite his thoughtful and loving demeanor, Joshua Washington had been having a lot of mental health issues in the previous year. According to his parents and previous doctors, he struggled with major depressive disorder ever since his younger teen years, having seen various professionals at 5 different psychiatric departments since the age of 12, though a couple of them had speculated that schizophrenia may also have been the cause of the episodes which caused him to be taken out of school on occasion. He had spent a bit of time at the Ocean View Hospital in California, their home state, just a few months before his sisters went missing, and he had to return there shortly after his sisters' disappearances as well. It was a fact that he and his parents kept hush-hush, even from family members. But now, the extent to which the 20-year-old's mind had been troubling him had begun to show through. After the disappearance of his sisters, Joshua's condition had been reported to have gotten even worse. And though to his parents he had seemed to have gotten a bit better in the months leading up to the annual getaway at the lodge, there was always the possibility that his cheery, stable demeanor had just been a facade to hide what he had been planning to do to the rest of his so-called friends. and convince his parents that it was a good idea for them to continue the tradition of going up to the lodge that year. Joshua had been taking time to venture up to the lodge a couple weeks before the event to do what would normally be the routine maintenance and housekeeping, but it seemed more and more that that particular year, Joshua had been doing more than what he was letting on. The setup that investigators found was elaborate, with cameras in numerous places, expertly placed jump scare mechanisms, and a high-tech viewing station through which everything could be controlled and monitored. A lot of time and resources had clearly been spent on these items, and had to have been set up by someone who knew the location well. After all, half of these items were placed well away from the living space of the lodge, and in parts of the old discontinued Blackwood Pines Hotel. When asked about Josh's behavior that night, and his personality in the time leading up to the trip, neither Jessica nor Matthew could cite any really strange behavior. They weren't particularly close with Joshua, especially since the previous year. So now the question was, could Joshua really have used this trip to inflict horrible pranks on his friends, and did those pranks actually have anything to do with why Michael Monroe had 2 fingers missing, and why there was an unknown stranger's blood present near the shed? And what about the events with Jessica? Following the path where she would most likely have been taken through to the mines, authorities couldn't find anything out of the ordinary. According to Jessica, whatever had taken her was supposedly living in the mines, but there wasn't anything in that section of the mines closest to the guest house. Investigators posited that it may have possibly been a wild animal, which seemed possible to Jessica herself, since she never actually saw what had been dragging her from behind. She later remembered that she and Michael had had a brief encounter with what they believed to be a bear or some kind of woodland predator in the woods that night, and considered it may have been possible for said predator to have attacked her and carried her from the guest house. While this theory didn't hold much weight, as it was uncharacteristic for the animals and other creatures in the area to exhibit the described behavior, it was all they could come up with, and investigators soon dismissed Jessica's account as having had anything to do with the lodge disaster. But it did encourage search teams to scan the nearby mining tunnels once again for any trace of Joshua, just as they had done for Hannah and Beth the year prior. The mining tunnels were vast, winding, and went on for miles. They couldn't find anything in the areas of the mines that the missing kids would have had potential access to. Weeks passed, and no further discoveries in the case would be made. One thing was certain. They had to find Joshua Washington, but with no further leads, his disappearance risked going just as cold as his sister's. Again, all of Blackwood County was made aware of another Washington missing persons case. Robert Washington again was expending more and more of his resources to find his last remaining child, even alerting authorities in California were Joshua to have actually shown up back in the US. In the meantime, families of all 5 lodge victims were grieving the loss of their children. All of them had bright futures ahead of them, having been accepted into colleges where they had just begun pursuing their dream careers. More and more, there was the theory circulating that Joshua Washington had orchestrated the murder of the 5 teens found dead at the lodge, perhaps as revenge for what had happened to his sisters the previous year. A rumor that was fervently denounced by the Washingtons. While it was accepted that Joshua may have planned various humiliating pranks that night, the Washingtons denied that he would ever have it in him to intentionally murder his friends. But as information about Joshua's condition surfaced, more and more people began to blame him, which for Robert and Melinda just added insult to injury. After all, Joshua's fate was still unknown, and people could potentially be blaming an innocent man. Still of interest was the blood of an unidentified person left at the shed, and it would take some time before investigators could obtain enough information to cite that the blood would have belonged to someone from the Fiddler family. And coincidentally enough, the only person of interest in the previous disappearances of Hannah and Elizabeth happened to be the ever-elusive Jack Fiddler. Still, this information wouldn't do much for the case, as relatives of the Fiddler family hadn't had any idea about what had happened on the mountain, nor did they have any contact with Jack in the past 3 years. They couldn't specify any other family members who may have gone missing in the Blackwood area, nor was anyone in the Fiddler family noticed to have been injured in the preceding months, around the day of the lodge incident either. Jack Fiddler had only ever owned one small property quite some distance away, and it was just a small rundown cabin, which when investigators had visited, it didn't look like it had been lived in for years. Fiddler didn't have a registered phone number and certainly wasn't on any kind of social media, so authorities really had no way of finding him. But with the news that this man could have potentially been on their property that night, the Washingtons believed that he had something to do with the tragedy that occurred that day. Authorities were told to be on the lookout for Fiddler, but they still had no concrete evidence of his involvement in the events of the teen's death or the disappearance of Joshua. So time passed, and much like the disappearance of the twin Washington girls, the case of Joshua Washington also went cold, and with it, many of the events of the mountain that night remained a foggy mystery. Many ran with the theory that Joshua was responsible for the fire as revenge for his sister's disappearance, and even the removal of Michael Monroe's fingers, in some twisted act of torture. Those who run with this theory think that he somehow managed to escape the mountain that night, with him hoping authorities would buy the story that he had been murdered by some unknown maniac. Some believed that maybe he ran off somewhere deep inside the mines, owing to his depraved mental state. His family thought that he could have been a victim of foul play himself, asserting that there had to be some connection between their 3 kids' disappearance and the presence of Fiddler on the mountain that night. Some believe that what happened on the mountain that night was just a string of accidents due to the actions of rowdy drunk teenagers. But it is worth mentioning that one of the stories written in the fake newspapers found by investigators held an eerily familiar reference to what ended up happening at the lodge. The fake article reads, "Aggravated arson committed on Blackwood Pines." Now, while the story was fabricated, the mention of a slighted employee sentenced to prison for arson hit a bit too close to home to ignore. When it came to the survivors, Matthew and Jessica, both of them couldn't claim to have any good explanation for what happened at the lodge while they were outside. However, strangely, both teens seemed convinced that whatever happened that night wasn't just a case of some awful crimes committed by Josh or some stranger. They'd claimed that there had been a feeling of something sinister on the mountain that night that neither of them could quite explain. Something in the woods and in the mines. Something that might have affected everyone else and somehow caused everything to happen the way it did. Jessica, in particular, was convinced that Hannah and Elizabeth would have likely been attacked and carried away by something in the woods, just like she was. And that's why they've never been found. And for anyone else who may have ventured outside that night and was missing now, the same may have happened to them. These vague intuitions the kids had didn't hold much water with most people, especially not investigators. However, going back to the traditions of the native Cree tribe, there had always been folklore of spirits in the mountain, and tales of people who don't respect the nature of the sacred area going insane in the past. If you're a believer of the paranormal, perhaps it's plausible that the mountain does in fact hold some sort of power of insanity that drives rational people to do horrible things, or maybe just run away never to be seen again. Or maybe there is some strange entity in the woods that lies in wait to take unsuspecting travelers away so that they're never seen again. But what's for certain is that none of the 3 Washington children have ever been found. Jack Fiddler never turned up again, and following that fateful February of 2015, the Washingtons' once wonderful vacation getaway home laid burnt, empty, and abandoned to this day. And so Blackwood Mountain remains a graveyard of old structures, abandoned mines, abandoned sanatorium, abandoned lodge, abandoned hotel. The once lively and business-filled mountain would now lay dead and forgotten, as the site of multiple heartbreaking tragedies, and that's how it would remain to this day.